afternoon, everybody, and welcome to everyone to this joint CEPR OECD webinar, which I think is gathering an amazing amount of intelligence and work on gender and other diversity issues on the labor market. The origin of this workshop actually stems from a conversation with Helene, who oversees the CEPR program on this issue. As you know, Helene has found the time to do that on top of her many other duties. And also, this is a bit late in March. In March, we showed the idea of having a state-of-the-art seminar about the evolution of economic knowledge regarding gender and other forms of diversity over the past decades. And the first thing I have to do is really to warmly thank Helene for reaching out to the top researcher that you can see around this virtual table. And Helene has made this workshop possible, and I'm very grateful to her and Bertrand who helped her. The second thing I have to do is to introduce the OECD Deputy Secretary General in charge, among many other things, of the OECD gender work, Masakono, who has agreed to give a very snappy overview of the OECD work on gender. And then I will introduce Marianne, who, even so she doesn't need an introduction, but she's agreed to give the key speech of this lecture, and we are immensely grateful to her. But for the time being, I will ask Kono Masa to start opening the seminar.
Thank you, Laurence, and thank you, Helene, for organizing this timely discussion. I'm very much honored and delighted to join our distinguished friends and colleagues to discuss diversity and the prejudices in the labor market and society. Now, over the past 12 months, the COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the inherent gender inequalities of nearly every system in every part of the world, including in employment, pay, leadership, share of unpaid work, finance, the list goes on. And it is evident that women continue to shoulder a large share of the COVID-19 burden. They are disproportionately affected by the crisis, often due to lack of voice, lack of physical and economic security, lack of deep-rooted, and then because of deep-rooted socio-cultural barriers. And although our latest interim economic outlook that Laurence recently presented, it projects global GDP to bounce back by 5.6% in 2021, 4% in 2022, that is in the near term. But there are so many uncertainties ahead, and this would possibly or could even likely exacerbate the labor market crisis. And indeed, the OECD Economics Department has ongoing work examining the long-term scarring effects of the crisis on women. Today, women are paid 13% less than men across the OECD on average, and as a result, many women have dropped out of or considered dropping out of the labor market altogether because it has simply become impossible for them to handle added care responsibilities alongside work. Even before the crisis, as we all know, women were already performing over 75% of unpaid care work, more than 3 times as much as men. The COVID-19 has really exacerbated such inequalities, and this has pushed many women out of the job market. And we have figures like the US in which 2.5 million women have been let go, fired, or have resigned from their posts versus 1.8 million men since March 2020. Now, women have taken more paid labor since the start of the 20th century. Men's contribution to unpaid care and domestic work has not increased enough to compensate for this change. It's clear that men have to change their own ways of life. So just an example is the parental leave. There is still a persisting gender bias that women should be the carers. And this is why in many of the OECD countries, fathers still account for less than 20% of those taking paid parental leave. Furthermore, only 39 countries mandate paid paternity leave compared to the 73 countries that mandate paid maternity leave. And labor market discrimination and prejudice is still a big obstacle for women, and we need to redouble our efforts to change this urgently. However, this is a complex issue that requires an integrated approach to promoting changes in policies, corporate culture, and social norms and traditions. So our speakers today will certainly allude to it, but diversity is not just about promoting women, of course. Um, Alongside with this gender issue, um, for example, in some OECD countries, ethnic minorities have to spend up to 50% more time looking for work other than job seekers within the same qualifications. Um, uh, and by the way, a study at the OECD also highlights that homosexual applicants are about 50% likely to be invited to a job interview than their heterosexual counterparts, and are 11% less likely to hold a high managerial position. Um, there's so many issues. All such discrimination really hampers economic development through a wide range of channels, and it reduces economic output by excluding or undervaluing potential talents in the labor market and impairing their mental and physical health as well as their productivity. And so gender equality, diversity, growth, they're all inseparable. And to make progress in this area, we need the whole of government, whole of stakeholders, and whole of society to join forces. And so, long way of saying, I really look forward to a rich and fruitful discussion today. And thank you for letting me participate.
Thank you, Masa. And thanks for this very nice and quick overview of the OECD work. So let me now turn to Marianne. First, Marianne, thanks very much for taking the time to share with us your immense work in this area. When I discussed with Helene the idea of the seminar, I told her it would be fantastic to have somebody who can span gender economic research for the past 20, 30 years. And she obviously thought about you and the immense work you've done, as well as the three fantastic women on the panel afterwards. You're a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, a research fellow at the NBR, CEPR, an institute for the study of labor. You have an applied microeconomist background covering labor economics, corporate finance, development economics, which is very large by any benchmark. And what we're going to hear today is some of the immense work you've done in the field of labor economics, focusing on gender. Last year at the American Economic Association annual conference, mine gave the Richard Ely lecture, and I think it's been very, very encompassing, and I'm really looking forward to hear the lecture that you are giving today. Again, let me thank you for agreeing to give a speech and share the results of all your research with us. We're very much looking forward to your talk. Thanks a lot, Marianne.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Laurence, and thanks for inviting me to do this. And what I'm going to do here is kind of give an overview of this article that was published last year in 2020 on gender in the 21st century in the papers and proceedings for the AEA. And I'm not going to touch much at COVID, maybe just a few times here and there when I see kind of new questions that are going to be clearly emerging kind of going forward in light of what has happened over the last year. So I'll start with, kind of a summary, I think kind of with some overlap with what, kind of Masa talked about. And I still believe that as much as we should worry about, kind of gender differences in the labor market, I think it's really important to keep in mind that there has been really, really steady progress. And, that's true in most part of the world. So this is, kind of World Bank data looking at female labor force participation. In the last kind of 25 years, we see that most countries have been kind of increasing their female labor force participation. And that's really a key indicator, right? That means kind of more earnings, more financial independence, and, kind of signs of things moving in the right direction. We also kind of have some sense as to, kind of the changes that have enabled this increase in female labor force participation. And education is one of the biggest one. I think if you look around the world, it used to be 25 years ago that you would see, a deficit in terms of girls' completion of primary schooling and secondary schooling compared to boys. Again, across most of the world, sub-Saharan Africa being kind of one of the, kind of biggest exceptions, we've seen women kind of catching up to men. And we know, some of the forces that are driving that, from like decline in like infertility, better family planning policies, conditional cash transfers that have, kind of incentivized more girls schooling. So again, a sign of, very, very steady and meaningful progress. In fact, if you look at, kind of developed countries, which are going to be my focus for most of this lecture, we have, kind of what is now kind of, I think, a fairly well-known phenomenon that girls are completing tertiary education at a higher rate than men, with just, I think, Japan as being kind of the biggest exception in this regard, right? So there's been a reversal of the gender gap in education. This particular figure that I'm showing here, to be honest, I don't think we quite have a really good explanation for why, what's driving that. When it comes to pay, as Masa mentioned, at the OECD level, if you look at full-time, kind of full-time employment, women earn about, kind of 86 cents for every dollar that men earn. The US is kind of smack in the middle at the OECD average. Also very well known that Scandinavian countries, kind of down there. I'm not sure. Can you see my cursor? Right, Scandinavian countries are down there, so I have lower, kind of lower pay gap and lower labor force participation gap. Some countries, Korea and Japan, kind of not doing as well. That's the situation in 2017. If you look at the changes, even over the last 10 years, you can see that most countries are in this bottom quadrants, meaning that they continue to be, kind of steady progress in terms of the gender gap in labor force participation shrinking and the gender pay gap shrinking as well. Again, as has been very often discussed, the US, seem to have kind of, been more stuck than other OECD countries over the recent years. And finally, kind of something that is of interest to me is what's happening at the very top of, of the earnings distribution. That's harder to study, but we have some good studies from France and the US based on administrative kind of pre-tax data. And you can see, again, in both cases, some progress with the share of women in the top 10% of the income distribution having been increasing over time. Even in the top 1%, you see a growing but still abysmally small share of women, but kind of continued progress. So if I had to think, let me try to move this window. It's kind of bothering me, much better. So if you have to think about kind of what are the remaining sticking points, especially in the developed world context, there are two things that I would like, to highlight and spend some time on. One is, despite what has been happening in terms of number of years of completing schooling, right? Where, as I said before, kind of women have more than caught up to guys. The fact that it remains systematic gender differences in educational choices. And then, the second, I think quantitatively very important, factor in explaining the remaining gender pay gaps are really, the gender differences in the labor market penalties that are associated with becoming a parent. So let me start by, kind of talking about, these two remaining pay points, which, have to do with different choices that, kind of women make compared to men at important point of their lives, and are, quantitatively, I think, very important factors in explaining the remaining gender pay gap. So let me start with, educational choices. And I think this is, to me, a really striking picture, again, kind of based on OECD data, which is really fantastic source for, for doing all of this work. This kind of shows you the share of men on the x-axis and women on the y-axis that complete a tertiary degree in a STEM-heavy field, especially math-heavy STEM. So think about engineering, math, computer science, and physics. And throughout the OECD, you see, way more men than women kind of graduating in the STEM. In some countries, up to 45% of men, kind of have a tertiary degree in the STEM. If you look at women, that share never reaches anything above 20%. So why, why is this important? And just to complete the picture, you can see that these differences in the STEM are extreme. You don't see that much when it comes to, like, say, business degrees or law degrees. You see a much greater share of women than men kind of completing tertiary degrees in the humanities. So why is this kind of STEM deficit for women a quantitatively important factor for the pay gap? Well, because those kind of STEM heavy fields actually pay more in the labor market. So this is based on a figure that I did with just US data, US Census data. But imagine the exercise of, take men and women born in a certain year, and then assign to these men and women born in a certain year the earnings of men that have completed the same highest degree as they have, right? So try to kind of quantify the dollar penalties associated with the degree that you complete. And what you can see, right, is do this exercise across birth cohort. You can see that for the birth cohort of the 1950s, if you looked at the expected gender pay gap in mean earnings, again, solely due to making different educational choices, in the 1950s, just based on the degree that you decide to pursue, you would have said that women should earn 15 cents less than men simply because of the educational choices. You see progress over time as this blue line is declining up until, pretty much my birth cohort, and very little progress after that. So solely just based on educational choices, if you are to, predict the gender gap in earnings, it would still be 6 cents on the dollar, for the birth cohort up to like the mid-1980s. If you were to just not do this based on mean earnings, but do this, trying to predict 90th percentile earnings, assign 90th percentile earnings, again, just based on the educational choices, that's, the green light over here. You would have predicted, just based on that, a close to 25%, kind of gap in earnings between men and women. Again, that has been declining, but it is still about, 10% by the 1985 birth cohort. Okay, so I think educational choices really do matter. Another figure that I really like to, use when stressing this is based on, kind of Claudia Goldin's amazing work, where she focused, again, this is just US data, focus on the 80 or so highest paid occupation in the US. You can see the mean men earnings in those occupations. And then on the y-axis, you can see the gender gap, right? So first, you can see that across all of these occupations, right, all of the dots are below zero. It means that in all of these highest paid occupation, women earn less than men. But I think what is striking is that the gap, is not constant across occupation. And in particular, those science and tech-based occupations, right, have much smaller pay gaps than business occupations, for example, in the red, or health-related occupations in the blue. Now, Claudia has a lot of, kind of fascinating work that tell us that this has something to do with the kind of work that you do in the STEM or tech field compared to business, and the added flexibility that you have in those fields, and a lower price that you have to pay for that flexibility, right? So more women in those fields look like it would help in terms of decreasing the gender pay gap. The second factor that I think has been subject to a lot of fantastic studies over the last decade or so is in documenting the vast gender differences in the labor market penalties that are associated with becoming a parent. Right, so this is based on work that Harry Clevin did not so long ago, but multiple people have contributed to this field. this, the study behind, each of these event studies is essentially, fairly simple. Track the earnings of a mother and a father, right, before and after the birth of their first child. Okay, and repeat that across countries. So we have done that has been working in Denmark and Sweden, the UK and the US, and then I have a hard time seeing what's on that side, Austria and Germany, right? So each of these figures qualitatively look exactly the same, right? The birth of a child is essential, or the first child is essentially a non-event for fathers, and it is a drastic event for mothers. Across all of these kind of developed countries, the birth of the first child means an immediate drop in women's earnings. And even though there's somewhat of a recovery, right, there's never a full return to the trajectories that these women were on before becoming mothers. What's also very clear from each of these pictures is that the extent to which motherhood becomes a big penalty in terms of earnings for women differs quite dramatically across OECD countries, with very drastic, long-term impact in places like Germany and Austria, and somewhat, kind of smaller, longer-term penalties in places like Denmark and Sweden. Okay. In fact, and I really like this picture from another paper by Clement and Landais. If you look at a country like Denmark and try to, go back over time and try to think about what is, explaining the gender pay gap in Denmark, well, this picture tells you a few things. First, there's no doubt that the gender pay gap is decreasing over time, from about 45% for the 1980s birth cohort to now about 20% for the more recent, not birth cohort, the most recent years. But kind of you can also see that the share of this kind of gender pay gap that is purely education related, my first point, is being decreasing as the educational choices have converged in Denmark between men and women. And the most finally kind of striking thing is that if you were to look at Denmark today, right, based on their study, you would say that this, kind of penalty associated with children is essentially the factor explaining why there's a gender pay gap in, as progressive a society as Denmark today, and the only factor out there. So again, my point here is to say that this is a really important force. And we've also made, I think, a lot of great progress in terms of explaining kind of why, women start kind of suffering so much in terms of their earnings at the birth of the child. It's a combination of factors, right? So some of it is just kind of reduction in labor supply, sometimes fully exiting the labor force, other times kind of switching to more part-time work. And we also know that in those higher paying occupations that, I've, studied in the past, but Claudia and Larry Katz have studied a lot as well, even small reductions in, labor supply, small reduction in hours worked, translate into very large drop in earnings, because in these high paying occupations, especially in the business sector, in the law, the penalties you face for asking for a little bit more flexibility are very, very large, okay? We also know that the drops in earnings when the child is born also have to do with switching occupations that typically have lower hourly wage rates. So switch from the private sector to the public sector. I think that's a big part of the story in Scandinavia, or switch to self-employment, moves that have to do with, again, kind of seeking more flexibility. And there's also kind of additional constraint on job search when one becomes a father. There's some recent really interesting work that documents that women kind of look for work that is more closely related to where they live. And these, kind of this restricted job search, the fact that women kind of look for shorter commute is consequential in explaining the gender gap in earnings. So this last bullet point is a place where I think in the light of COVID and where the economy is going to be going, I think is an interesting one, because with more work going remote, one could imagine that these last forces could become less important in the future. So this whole slide is, I think, an area for really interesting future research because of the move to remote work for a lot of occupations and a potential silver lining in the COVID crisis that has been, as Masa said, so far, kind of really particularly hurting women. Okay, so now let me kind of transition to kind of what do I do with this? What do I do with this fact? So hopefully I've convinced you that quantitatively, right, if I try to explain the gender pay gap in labor market outcomes, gender pay gap, in earnings, it seems to be associated, right, with different choices men and women are making, right? So saying that, you could ask yourself, well, what's, kind of what's the problem if it's about women and men making, different choices? And I really think that there are two views one could have there, right? The first view, which is that essentially kind of these different choices are just rational, self-interested calculations that men and women make, right? And why would they make different calculations, different decisions in terms of the degrees that they pursue or what they want to do when they have children? Well, it could be reflection differences in skills, right? So maybe women just are not as good as math, or women have a comparative advantage when it comes to nurturing and child-rearing activities. Or it could be a reflection of, differences in preferences, right? So maybe women do not like math, or women really prefer to be caregivers and are willing to sacrifice labor market kind of opportunities for the sake of being caregivers. The second view is that these different choices that men and women make are really more a reflection of powerful stereotypes about gender-specific skills and gender-specific roles, okay? And I'm going to try to spend some time kind of thinking about, kind of these two views and what we know about separating these two views. But crucially, I think they are really, really important, right? A lot of the work that is being discussed in terms of like, kind of how much the economy would be better, how much more growth we would have if women were equally represented in the economy compared to men, right? All of that work strongly relies on the idea that skills are equally distributed at birth between men and women, right? If I take that away, then the efficiency implications for getting rid of all these gender pay gaps start kind of, disappearing. Similarly, if women have got different preferences and really want to be, more engaged in showering activities, the welfare implications of going further in terms of reducing these gender gaps are not as clear. So I think there's a really important contrast between these two things. So what I would like to, as I said, going forward is talk about, kind of these two views and talk really about stereotypes and what are stereotypes, and make it clear that really fully distinguishing between these two views in the presence of stereotype is very, very difficult, because the stereotypes are going to tell us that the differences in skills and traits and preferences that we observe, right, may not be essential, but they may themselves be endogenous to the stereotypes that are out there. And I'm going to try to make that point as clearly as I can. But before I do that, I think it's really important to kind of try to define stereotypes, and gender stereotypes and how one think about them. And if you, kind of think about economics, we don't talk much about stereotypes in economics, right? In fact, I think the only place where we talk about stereotypes in economics is a model of statistical discrimination, right? And these models are rooted in imperfect information. And the way we think about stereotypes in those models is that they are rational belief-based discrimination. I have accurate beliefs about the distribution of a trait or preference, among all the individuals that belong to a particular group. Okay. And in economics, we really stress the descriptive nature of these stereotypes, right? An employer, doesn't know exactly how good a woman is at math, but he has an accurate belief of how good at math the average woman is. So in economics, we focus on the descriptive nature of stereotypes. It's beliefs about what men typically do or the way they typically are. Okay. I think what's really useful to think more deeply about stereotypes is to move away from the way we think about them in economics and kind of bring perspective from, psychology and social psychology in particular. So in social psych, we don't typically believe that, stereotypes need to be accurate or need to be rational. So that view is being kind of relaxed. And we view stereotypes as some kind of generalization that we have about, about groups, about genders, typically to economize on cognitive resources. And really importantly, in social psych, when one talks about stereotypes, one doesn't only view them as descriptive, the way men or women typically are, but also prescriptive, right? The way men and women should be or ought to be, or what they should do or ought to do. Okay. And this prescriptive nature of the stereotypes then start changing men and women's self-views about what is appropriate for their group to be or their group to do, right? And that's very much the idea of gender identity norms, which has found a place in economics. And certainly the work that George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton did back in the early 2000s is the place where you see that, right? So those stereotypes start entering the utility function in the work that they do. Okay? There's a lot of fascinating work in social psychology about why these stereotypes, these gender stereotypes are prescriptive, but at the core, a lot of this work in psychology talks about the fact that there's this very high level of contact between men and women, and they end up kind of sharing those beliefs about what each of the group ought to do, sometimes with a basic desire to be respected and included as a proper and a good group member. Okay. One picture that, it's not very precise, but I'm going to say there, but I always find this picture, kind of fascinating. A lot of us that use World Value Survey data or GSS data and try to measure sexism across countries in the world, right? I very soon realized that whether you try to measure whether a place is sexist or not based on what the men say or what the women say essentially gives you the same thing. So this picture really is a good reflection, again, of, I think, the fact that these beliefs are shared across the gender, right? Reported here for a set of countries is the share of men on the x-axis and the share in women on the y-axis that believe that men should be first in line when it comes to a job. And you are not on the 45-degree line, but you're not very far from the 45-degree line. Right? There are shared views among all of those countries about, kind of where men and women belong in society, right? So when I tried to contrast, view 1 and view 2, one of the things I talked about is that, well, maybe women want to stay home and take care of children, right? Maybe it's their preference. The point of this slide is to say that it's very difficult to think about what someone's preference is when one think about gender stereotypes as being prescriptive, right? If, I should do something, right? If I should be a caregiver, right? Is the gender norms? Well, that becomes part of my utility function. That becomes an internalized thing. So the idea that they are, kind of, when you think about rational self-interest in the presence of gender norms, right? What preferences become these very ambiguous concepts, right? I'm doing what I think I should be doing, and that's part of my utility function, right? So again, the difficulty of thinking about what our preferences versus what are stereotypes when stereotypes are prescriptive, right? And here really kind of when you think about self-interest in the presence of gender norms, there's really two ways, that I like to think about it. One is that these gender stereotypes have really been internalized. They're really part of my utility function, right? I'm expected to stay home and take care of my kids, right? I'm going to do that. It's part of the way I think about myself and what I should be doing. there's a different way to think about rational self-interest here, which is that maybe they haven't become part of my utility function, but I face a cost if I deviate from what is expected from me. I'm worried about reputation concern. I'm worried about what other people are going to be thinking of. In both cases, whether it's fully internalized part of the utility function, or whether the gender stereotypes become this additional cost if I deviated from it because of image concerns, the bottom line is still the same, right? What is in my rational self-interest now becomes very much a function of these gender norms and of these gender stereotypes. I think trying to kind of make this point again, probably a little bit too loose of a manner, but I'm going to go back to the cross-country data. So the picture that you saw before, this is 2017. This is log GDP and female labor force participation. This is a standard kind of U curve that people have been talking about, right? In low level of economic development, high share of female labor force participation, and then kind of it goes down for a while in middle income countries and then goes back up in high income countries. We have some kind of stories related to structural change that are meant to explain this this U curve in female labor force participation. You move from agriculture that can be done at home, you have more heavy industry, female labor force participation kind of decreases, and then in later stage of economic development, manufacturing becomes smaller, the share of the service sector increases, women go back to work. If you were to just try to apply these stories to the last kind of 25 years, is there a sense that female labor participation is going down when agricultural sector decreases, going down when manufacturing increases, going up when the share of the service sector increases? The answer is essentially no. These are all flat lines. So if you try to apply these kind of industrial structural change to the U curve that we see today, it just doesn't fit the data, right? What I think is a visually much more, kind of enlightening way to think about the differences in female labor force participation throughout the world today is a picture like this one, which is essentially breaking down those countries into 3 buckets. The one with low level of sexism in the red, middle level of sexism in the green, and high level of sexism in the blue. And you can see there is that they're barely in the U curve. What happens to be is that the share of mainly medium income countries, right, that have very very conservative gender norms. Okay, so again, going back now to my point about kind of endogenous preferences and preferences that are endogenous to gender norms. If you look at some of these countries in the blue, one that I would like to highlight is Saudi Arabia, right? This is a place where we know that these gender norms are extremely conservative. There are extreme constraints on women's ability to participate in the labor force. You would assume that women in Saudi Arabia would be feeling really bad about this situation, right? If you look at well-being data, these are my middle income countries. This is average male well-being and average female well-being in the blue. There's no sense that you see like these bigger gaps in well-being in those high sexism middle income countries like Saudi Arabia, right? The preferences, the utilities, kind of do not reflect the constraints that we know a lot of these women are facing in some of these highly sexist countries. Again, for me, it's another way to think that these norms have been internalized and are, kind of driving utility. In fact, if you were to look at the gender gaps in well-being as a function of sexism in the country, you would come to the opposite of what some people might have expected, is that it looks like women are in fact, slightly happier than men in countries that are more sexist compared to countries that are less sexist. And it looks like women are somewhat happier than men in countries where the labor force participation is more constrained, okay? So again, I'm kind of repeating this point maybe too often, but I think to me it's important because very often, kind of when people see these facts about, women are making those choices, maybe it's their preferences, what preferences are in an environment where gender norms are and gender stereotypes are prescriptive becomes a very, very complicated concept. And it's a more general conversation one should have here about what is well-being and how one defines well-being in situations where people may, adapt to misery and, may not perceive, kind of that they lack freedom, right? There's this quote that I have in the papers and proceedings that I really like by Martha Nussbaum, who's, kind of a philosopher, but, it reflects some of the, I'll let you read the quote, reflects some of the experiences I think many of us have had in maybe developing country context and try to like tell women, kind of, you should not like what you have, you shouldn't like all these constraints. And very often, kind of, there's not a real desire for change because these have become their internalized preferences. All right, maybe I'll skip this for the sake of time. Okay. Going back now to, I've talked about preferences in, kind of when we think about a situation where there are prescriptive stereotypes. I also want to talk a little bit more about how one thinks about gender difference in skills and traits in the situations where there are prescriptive gender stereotypes. And the important thing here to, to have in mind is that gender stereotypes, both because of the descriptive, but also the prescriptive nature, create some self-fulfilling prophecies, which make it difficult in observed data to really determine whether or not there are essential differences between the gender and skills, right? So why? Because of the descriptive nature. Well, that's work that we have done in economics, right? If you think that there's statistical discrimination against a particular group, well, that group might just decide it's not worth their while to invest much because they're going to be discriminated anyway, right? So the skills become endogenous and, they're the gender or group differences in skills become a reflection of those stereotypes. The prescriptive nature of gender stereotypes is even more mechanical, right? I'm not good at math. I should not be good at math. I'm not expected to be good at math. I'm not going to be good at math. And that's a very large literature started by, Aronson and Steele, that is based on the idea of the gender stereotype threat, right? We have hundreds of studies where, we ask women and men to take, a math test, but in one of the treatments, we're going to reinforce to women before they take this test that they are women, and they end up not doing as well on the math test, right? So the differences in skills and traits that we observe end up being endogenous to the stereotypes, both for descriptive, but really much more mechanically because of the prescriptive nature of the stereotypes. Now, that allows me to tie back to one of the key factor I said before was quantitatively important in explaining the gender pay gap, which is the lack of women in the STEM, and especially in the math-heavy STEM. Now we have really good literature, both using microdata and using macrodata, that very much suggest that the gender gaps in performance in math, are at least in part a reflection of these stereotypes, right? So we have, evidence from this very nice study with Italian data that shows that women in a classroom are going to do worse on their math test score if they're assigned to a teacher that is stronger implicit bias against women and math. And that women's self-confidence in math is also going to be affected by the views of their teacher. We have lots of macro work as well. So, kind of this is, kind of the fact using the PISA data that shows that across essentially, all OECD countries, women are doing worse below the 5-degree lines compared to male in math tests. And then when you try to explain these cross-country differences, what becomes pretty clear is that they are very much correlated with the gender norms and gender attitude in those countries. So on the left is a study by Luigi Zingales and some of my other colleagues at Chicago, where you have in the yellow here the gender gap in math. You can see women underperform in all countries except Iceland. And here in the red, you have some measure of gender norms, which is a women's emancipation measure. And you can see that, the more liberal the gender norms are, the smaller the gender gap in math, right? That is not consistent with essential differences between the gender in terms of how well they do in math, but very much a reflection that these gender gap in math is endogenous to the gender norms. On the right is a nice study that looks at Eastern European countries and Western European countries. right? And look at the gender gap in mass today in those countries. And you can see that it is systematically smaller in ex-Eastern European countries, which the author, Claudia Senik and Lippmann, tie back to, like, in the old days, in these kind of more Soviet style countries, there was a lot of, like, kind of efforts to try, for better or for worse, kind of push for, like, more gender equality, and everyone is going to be working and all of that. And you can still see the remnants of those kind of political kind of attitudes back in the days. So I think a lot of the work kind of out there very much convinced me that stereotypes are an important force in explaining why women, stay away from this time. I think it's also worthwhile to reflect more generally about what we know about, kind of whether or not there are systematic difference between the gender in skills or traits or preferences, right? Despite what I said before, the difficulty in actually kind of measuring that because of the self-fulfilling nature. And also what we know about how accurate the beliefs are about any of these gender differences that may exist. And I would like to tie that, that discussion to the second factor that I discussed as being a quantitatively very important factor in explaining the gender pay gap, which is this motherhood penalty. And again, here, it's an area where, kind of much more work has been done outside of economics. But there's a set of studies, and Hyde is really the one person I go to, that have been done trying not to go one experiment at a time, one study at a time, but really conduct some meta-analysis to try to figure out, based on all of the studies that have been done, what do we know about gender differences between men and women on a range of traits. Okay? In this literature, the typical kind of way to measure that is what's called this Cohen's d statistic, which is essentially what's the difference between the average man and the average woman on this trait, and divide that by, kind of a sense of how much variation there is within those genders. Okay, so this is a depiction of this Cohen's d statistic in a case where, the value of the statistic is about 0.2, which is basically saying that, yeah, this is a case where men and women are different, right? But clearly, right, the within gender variation in the trait swamps the variation that you see between the genders, okay? So let's go and look at all of the traits that we have measured, and let's try to get a sense of, like, where this female distribution sits compared to this male distribution. Are they really apart from each other, or do they overlap a lot with each other? And my reading of this work, and this is a heavy slide, but my reading of this work that has been really systematic, not one study at a time, is that it points very much towards a gender similarities hypothesis. Across a wide range of traits, skills, attitudes, we tend to find more gender similarities than anything else, right? Cases where the statistics is about 0.2 or less than that. So yes, there are some small differences between the gender, but they are tiny compared to how much variation there is within each gender. Now, I think this literature, though, still points at some dimensions where the differences are much bigger. It seemed to be more systematic. And I'm listing them there, but, one dimension that comes back very often is this, this issue of agreeableness, tender-mindedness, kind of attitude, empathy towards others. That's really one trait where psychologists tend to find more systematic differences between men and women. Again, that's an important trait going back to, like, the motherhood penalty, because it does suggest that either women might be better at those tasks than men, or may have, more of a preferences for engaging in those tasks. Okay, so maybe, maybe that's not a problem. Now, the question is, though, after that is, like, kind of how accurate are our beliefs about these gender differences? And there's, again, a very rich literature in psychology talking about that. And, kind of tends to find that, kind of our beliefs tend to be broadly accurate, right? But I think there's one dimension where our beliefs tend to be not accurate. And it's, you know, I think very well illustrated by this study by my colleague Nick Epley. And it is on those dimensions where if I think about a man, if I think about a woman, I think that's the main differences between them. So let me just, you know, illustrate this work with two slides. So take a bunch of men and women and then ask them, you know, what is the woman's, you know, what makes men and women different? Yeah. Well, you know, people don't tend to think that men and women are very systematically different when it comes to like how happy they are. If you look at a dimension where, you know, kind of we think that men and women are more different, it's on trait like aggressiveness and empathy. Those are the first things that come to mind when thinking about the difference between a man and a woman. Yeah. Now, what Epley does in this work then is showing that it is on those traits that first come to mind when thinking about a man and a woman that our beliefs about how different they are tend to be the most strong and in particularly the most exaggerated. Okay, so just look at the bottom panel over here, which is a measure of empathy. Bring a set of men and women in the lab and get them to perform an empathy task. This is how they are performing on the task. And you can see there's a kernel of truth. Women are more empathetic than guys are, 66 versus 64. There's a kernel of truth. That's a trait that, you know, seems to be systematically different between the gender. But I think what's most remarkable is that you then ask the man and the woman to predict how well the women are going to do on this task and how well the men are going to do on this task. And there you see a much, much bigger differences, 68 minus 54, compared to the actual performance. Right? So again, what this shows is that on those dimensions that immediately come to mind when thinking about difference between a man and woman, we tend to exaggerate how really different they are. Put in another way, you know, women care more than guys, but not as much as what you think. And putting that under the prescriptive nature of the stereotype, not as much as you tell them that they should be more caring and more tender and more empathetic, right? And that, I think, is a really important point when thinking about where we go next in terms of like facing this, this additional kind of motherhood penalty, right? Okay, so I'm probably very close to end of time. So I'm going to go very quickly over the last few slides and maybe we can have them for question and answers. I think you can also see that this dimension of empathy, emotions, women being more sensitive is one of the remaining sticking points in survey data spanning more than half a century when people try to think, what's the difference between a man and a woman? In the old days, we used to think that men were more intelligent, but now, pretty much everybody thinks that, kind of men and women are kind of equal in intelligence and they're kind of equal on competence, right? But this dimension of communion, which again is about empathy and caring and tenderness, is one dimension where we still see people still see large differences between the gender, right? Which most likely, as I just said from the study before, are exaggerated, right? And really create stereotypes that are pushing us away from what should be quote unquote optimal. And it's kind of interesting as to why those stereotypes have a harder time disappearing than say those related to intelligence. And one, could imagine that those stereotypes about women being so much more tender and nice and caring are harder to get rid of than about women not being as intelligent because they're kind of positive. It's kind of nice to be, called nice. And maybe stereotypes that are less objectionable are just harder to get rid of. Okay, so I'm totally out of time, but I'm just going to say a few quick things on policy. So I think, on policy, I think that there's a really important role for research here and research to be more systematic. I feel like we write way too many papers that are about gender gaps in things. And I think that it's about something kind of wrong, I think, with the incentive that we have as researchers is that, studies that find gender gaps get published. Studies that don't find gender gaps have a much harder time, kind of being published. But if you think about how stereotypes persist, every piece of research that we write, that finds a gender gap is going to be part of the narrative kind of going forward. So I'm not asking for, I'm not asking for biased research. I'm asking for more, neutral research. If we had the same incentives to do meta-analysis work, to do replication work as we have to get the first paper published, we would have, I think, less of this phenomenon. This is my last slide. So I'll just stop there. I think we can talk about, kind of other policies in the discussion if there is time.
Thank you. That was super interesting, very nice. I'm sure not biased, even though you have a lot of empathy for the topic. And so it was great. I would start, I also think that it was particularly helpful to bring in stereotypes and the difference between the way economists and psychologists or social psychology looks at this issue. And I have a couple of questions, both from me actually and from the Q&A chat about this. I mean, you talk about policy and how we tend to behave like people expect each sex to behave. So a couple of questions on that. The first one is, are the influence of stereotypes as prevalent whatever the level of education, or is education helping you to move away from those? The second is, would that suggest, for example, that we should have same-sex schools and education, or should we mix people? What's the best to actually lead, girls to move into STEM, for example? Or again, does that vary can that vary with the level of development of the country? And perhaps a third additional question, which is if stereotypes are so prescriptive for gender, can we also infer that they are for other diversity forms like race or sex type? And do you have any evidence of all this? I'll stop here for the first part of your question.
Great. That's a lot of great questions, and I certainly don't have answers to all of them. The one, let me start with the second thing that you discuss about, kind of what is the right, kind of schooling environment to best address, stereotypes. I think that's very much an open question. There's a recent study that was not based on school, but based on family. But, kind of in families, sometimes, you only have girls, sometimes you have boys and girls. In that study suggested that gender stereotypes were stronger among women that were born with brothers, right? So it suggests that once you, kind of create a family environment where there are boys and girls together, they tend naturally to have more conversation about boy stuff and girl stuff. And, kind of they end up finding stronger stereotypes and stronger gender norms among women that were raised with brothers. But I think, this is only one study, and they might, kind of, I think this is very much, kind of an open question as far as I see it. The second thing you asked is whether a lot of what I said here applies to matters of, of race, different kind of sexual orientation. I very much think so, right? So the same way that we have a literature thinking about gender identity norms and what is expected of women, right? There's also some discussions about kind of racial identity and how racial identity can really shift our behaviors because of what beliefs is expected from, is expected from us. So there's nothing here that is, kind of very, solely related to gender. But I think one point that I always like to stress, especially kind of contrasting race and gender, is that, I haven't talked about direct discrimination against women much in this lecture, right? Not because I do not believe that it exists, not because I don't believe that there are, kind of very sexist, kind of workplaces. I do believe it exists, but I don't think it's as first order in explaining the remaining hurdles for women as the forces that I try to highlight here. When it comes to race, I would change that very much. When it comes to race, I would be much more upfront in thinking that standard, kind of discrimination, taste-based discrimination are really important factors in explaining what's holding racial minorities back. So this is one, kind of one big area of distinction. I think when I think about my work related to gender versus my work related to race. I think you may have asked something else, Laurence.
Yes, I'm aware I fired many questions at the same time. A couple of questions on how does this vary with the level of development? Like, what's the causality? If we're in a Western economy where forced participation of women is higher, for example, you highlighted Denmark and Germany, then would you expect to have in any case less stereotypes and less gaps than in countries with a lower level of development? And also, can you find, if you were to classify a population by level of education, can you see stereotypes declining with the level of education?
Yeah, so on the level of education ones, and seeing whether the stereotypes are declining or whether they are, kind of, I think importantly, as I said, right, kind of more precise, more accurate with education. I really don't know the answer to this question. When it comes to like the kind of across the world, kind of stereotype in economic development, as I tried to stress when I showed you kind of the U curve of, kind of female level participation by level of economic development, I think you see, kind of, I don't think there's such a strong correlation between economic development and gender norms, as I try to, make clear on this figure. There are lots of very poor countries and lots of very rich countries that are very kind of appear to be, fairly, living fairly like liberal gender norms. A lot of medium income countries with very conservative gender norms. So I think that there might be a causal relationship between economic development and gender norms, but the data does not scream it.
Okay, thanks. Then I had a couple of clarification questions, if that's okay with you. It's about, so I'm not sure if you've seen it in the slide, but about the competitive, do women compete less for job, have the less competitive appetite? Is that something that I remember one of your slides with a lot of quality differentials was showing that. Also, somebody asked, how do you measure sexism? And with the competition, I would say, how women, do they have different negotiation skills, or do we see them differently? And then there was so it's competition and negotiation, measure of sexism, and then is there any evidence on childless women that would depart from what you have shown?
Okay, so I mean, this question about, kind of willingness to negotiate, attitudes to a competition, risk preferences, again, so I would direct whoever asked this question to go back and read Hyde's work, which, covers a lot of these characteristics, not just one study at a time, but really trying to put all the evidence that we have together. And I don't remember the specifics of each of these characteristics, but certainly, kind of my reading overall is that risk preferences, even though we have lots of studies that are very well published that suggest that there are really systematic risk preferences between the gender, does not come up as like one dimension where, this appears systematically across studies. I would also direct the reader to this very nice piece, now kind of allows me to go back to my slide, that was done by Tinsley and Ellie, that again, kind of tries to do a meta-analysis on those traits that have been discussed so much more in economics, because there are, those clear ties. Women don't compete, and they don't work in Wall Street. Women are risk averse, and they don't take on some jobs. Women don't know how to negotiate. We have lots of studies that suggest that is the case. Once you try to put all these studies together, right, and not put more, kind of emphasis on the ones that find those traits, the evidence becomes much less overwhelming, right? So that goes back to me about like really the importance of the issues of publication bias, the need for more publication work, and all of that. So I guess my, in a nutshell, we should be very careful not to generalize based on a couple of studies.
Thanks. I am actually, I'm not supposed to have belief because we do evidence-based, but I tend to agree with what I see, at least around me. So I will spare you questions because I think we have eaten 10 more minutes than we were supposed to, but it was super interesting. And I will spare you the question about leadership in the COVID crisis, right? Have women perform better, women leaders perform better than men? We'll leave that to Helene's panel, which I'm sure will be, we have some appetite to answer that. Marianne, thanks a lot. It was brilliant. I really enjoyed it. And given the amount of questions that was in the chat, I'm sure everybody enjoyed it a lot as well. Many, many thanks again for what you did.
Thanks for having me. I look forward to the panel. Thank you.
Excellent. So good afternoon for those of you who are joining us now. We just had a fantastic keynote speech by Marianne. She covered a lot of ground, and I can still see some questions coming in. So her talk will be available also on the websites. For those of you who want to get more acquainted to all of the evidence she provided, which was very, very broad ranging. And now it's my pleasure to be the moderator for another very interesting part of this session, which is going to be a panel in which we are going to have three fantastic speakers as well. We are going to talk a little bit more broadly about diversity. So I'm going to briefly introduce the three speakers, and then we will get going. Please, if you have questions, do use the Q&A as you have been doing before, and I will try to relay your question after the three speakers have made their introductory remarks. So we have three professors here. Anna Aizer from Brown University. She's a professor of economics. She is the department chair also at Brown, and she has written on intergenerational transmission of economic status in particular, on health and inequality, on discrimination in the labor market, and she's the co-director of the NBER Children Program. Our second speaker will be Leah Boustan from Princeton University, where she is professor as well, and her research is really at the intersection of economic history and labor economics, and in particular, she has written a lot on migrants. She has written a book, competition also on competition in the promised land, Black migrants in northern cities and labor markets, published at Princeton University Press. Our third speaker will be Rachel Griffith from the University of Manchester, and the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and also CEPR. So Rachel has worked on many different topics, covering applied micro from industrial organization to labor markets and nutrition. And she was just appointed a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in the 2021 New Year honor list for services to economic policy. So that's congratulations, Rachel. And she will focus more on the effect of the pandemic in the short run on a number of outcomes. So we are going to start, if that's okay with you, Anna. So the floor is yours, and then we will move on to Leah and to Rachel at the end.
Okay, so thanks very much to Helene and the other organizers for inviting me to participate in such an important and interesting discussion. So the topic of my presentation will be the spillover effects of inequity in the labor market. And I'm going to pay particular attention to one group, and that is family members of those directly impacted by labor market inequities, and specifically to focus on children. Why focus on children? I think focusing on the spillover effects to children is important because it really illustrates the persistence of the negative effects of labor market inequities by highlighting intergenerational effects. And I'm going to discuss some of the research that has documented strong intergenerational effects of labor market inequities faced by two groups of workers, female workers and Black workers. So let's start with the first group. Let's start with the first group here, which is women. Economists have long applied household bargaining models to understand decision-making within households. And these decisions are very much influenced by the labor market opportunities of the adults in the household, typically a man and woman, though this need not always be the case. And one of the major implications of these models is that as women earn relatively more or have the opportunity to earn relatively more in the labor market, their bargaining position in the household improves. And this can and does have important implications for children. And I'm going to highlight two of them here. First, the improved bargaining position of women can influence household spending on children. Second, it can influence maternal health and well-being more generally, and this too generates important spillovers to children, as I'll explain in a minute. So in the US, we actually have an agency, the USDA, that every year estimates how much families spend raising a child. And the most recent estimate suggests that for a child born in 2005 in the US, families will spend anywhere from $174,000 to $372,000 over the course of the child's life raising that child. And it's important to note there's a lot of evidence that shows that when mothers control an increasing share of the household income, spending on children increases. And this evidence, some of which I've presented here, the citations here are based on both developed and developing countries. And why is this a case? Economists have generally posited two reasons for explaining this phenomenon. The first is that women may have a greater preference for investing in their children. We refer to this as a preference channel. The second is that women specialize in the production of child human capital, referred to as a specialization channel. Either channel can explain the phenomenon that we observe. So not only do we find that as women either earn more in the labor market or their opportunities to earn more in the labor market increase, does spending on children increase? But it's also the case that when women earn more in the labor market, we also see that we observe significant reductions in intimate partner violence against women. And this too is consistent with the household bargaining. Women with better outside labor market opportunities will be able to more credibly threaten to leave an abusive partner. And this has been documented in the US and the UK, that as labor market opportunities for women increase in terms of employment and wages, intimate partner violence against women declines. I'll show you here some data from the US. You see on the right is a graph showing trends in intimate partner violence by the gender of the victim from 1993 until about 2012. And what you observe is that between 1993 and 2003, there's a pretty significant decline in intimate partner violence against women. And this coincides with significant improvements in women's labor market opportunities as measured by the gender wage ratio, which increased over this period, 1993 to 2003, from about 70 cents on the dollar to 85 cents on the dollar. And then starting in 2003, where you see a flattening of this curve, is also when you observe a flattening of the wage ratio in the US. And so this is just, sort of correlational in nature, but there have been a number of studies that have used sort of more specific data and stronger identification techniques to establish a causal relationship between women's labor market opportunities and intimate partner violence. And of course, intimate partner violence, not surprisingly, has very important spillovers to children in the household. I'm going to focus on pregnancy in particular, where there's been a lot of work. So it is the case that intimate partner violence often initiates or escalates during pregnancy, and that has very negative and significant effects on newborn health, as measured by birth weight and prematurity. Birth weight is an incredibly important marker of newborn health, and evidence based on data from Norway in particular, but also the US and the UK, has shown convincingly that birth weight is highly predictive of many important long-term economic outcomes, including years of schooling, employment, and earnings in adulthood of children who were in utero during a violent episode. So again, just showing you that as women's labor market opportunities improve, we see significant improvements in investments in children and in their health and well-being more generally, which has very long-term implications with respect to that child's ultimate economic outcome. Now I'm going to shift to a second group that has experienced significant labor market inequities in the US, and that is Black workers. Most of the work sort of looking at labor market outcomes by race and the disparities therein have tended to sort of focus more on how racial disparities in educational outcomes might affect or influence racial disparities in labor market outcomes. But I'm going to highlight recent evidence suggesting sort of the opposite relationship is also quite relevant, and that is that racial gaps in labor market outcomes can explain gaps in the educational outcomes of the next generation. And to do this, we look at historical data, and we look back in time in the US. What you can see here in the left-hand side of the screen, I'm plotting racial gaps in labor, in wages, and over time, starting in 1940, all the way up to about 2017. And so the dark line is log wages for Black men, and the gray line is log wages for white men. And the red dotted line shows the difference. And what you can see here are there are two periods of significant improvements for Black workers in both relative and absolute terms. And that is the 1940s and the 1960s. Beginning in about 1980, it starts to plateau. If you look at the graph on the right side, that is plotting education as measured by high school completion rates, again by race. And what's important to note here is that starting in 1940, when children are aged 16 to 17 in this graph, you start to see significant improvements in relative and absolute terms for Black children. And that seems to coincide exactly with the significant improvements in the labor market outcomes of adults during this period. And so the question is, what's going on here? Can it be the case that what's going on in the adult labor market is actually influencing the educational decisions of the next generation? So we're going to focus on one period, which is the 1940s, right? So what happened during the 1940s? Well, there was pretty massive domestic war production effort in the US, spending about 40% of GDP on the war production effort. This was making tanks and munitions and uniforms and all of that. Not only was there a pretty massive war production effort, which resulted in significant increases in labor demand, there was in fact a federal ban on discrimination in hiring by race during the war years. Interestingly, it lasted from about 1941 to 1945. There were also some labor supply shortages, particularly among white men during this period. And so what we document looking at this period of the 1940s, that there were significant increases in both the absolute and relative wages of Black male workers during this period. And these effects were incredibly persistent. They persisted through at least 1970. The way we document this is we look at labor markets that received a larger share of these war contracts, right? So areas that were more involved in the war production effort, where there were bigger increases in labor demand, and where these federal requirements of non-discrimination were binding, we see significant improvements in the relative and absolute wages of Black men, and they persist. We argue that this is due in part to reductions in discrimination and hiring, because it's interesting to note, as soon as the war ended, the ban on discrimination was lifted, and of course the war contracts ended immediately. So the question is, what sort of spillovers, if any, did these have to the next generation? And to answer this question, we then look at the high school completion rates of children who should have graduated in, say, 1939, 1941, sort of the very beginning of the war, through all the way 1957, 1959, many years post-war. And what we do is we look at, again, those areas that received more war contracts and where we saw the biggest improvements in the wages and employment of Black adult workers during the war period. And in those same areas where we saw significant improvements in Black workers because of the more intense war effort as measured by the war expenditures, the contracts that were made with firms in the local labor market, we see in those same labor markets that the children of those workers were significantly more likely to complete high school. And we see this specifically among Black children. We see no effects for white children. So let me give you a sense of the size of the effects that we find. Basically, between 1940 and 1950, the high school graduation rate among Black adolescents increased from 25 to 40%. This effect persisted way beyond 1950. And we find that gains in the adult Black labor market opportunities and outcomes can explain about a third of this increase. And why would that be? Well, it's still the case that parental income is the single most important predictor of children's educational outcomes. And as you see that Black families earn increasingly more because of, for example, declines in discrimination, you should expect to see significant improvements in the educational outcomes of their children, which is what we see. Again, additional evidence that labor market inequities can have pretty significant and persistent and even intergenerational effects. So I'm just going to conclude here. I'll say, we didn't say very much about policy, but I'll just make 2 points. We have learned recently, I think it's become even more clear that tight labor markets can reduce gender and racial wage gaps, right? We saw that in the US in 2019, right? The labor market was incredibly tight and we were seeing significant gains for Black workers during this period. This mirrors what we saw in the 1940s, incredibly tight labor markets, improved labor market outcomes of Black workers over that period. But policy also matters, right? So it wasn't just a tight labor market in the 1940s, it was also this federal ban on discrimination in hiring. I think it was the combination of the two that really resulted in the outcomes that we observed. So it's just sort of, I think, a nice case that highlights the importance of both labor market opportunities and forces, but also the important role of the government in setting policy when it comes to labor market inequities. And I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Anna. Indeed, it's a very actually nice also a policy relevant point that you're making, given where we are right now with the COVID crisis and when governments are thinking about how much fiscal stimulus they should actually use to boost the economy and how tight the labor market should be. So we have a US experiment, but we're in a pretty different situation in Europe. And so that's really very important. And also to think through the effect on the next generation. So thanks a lot for these points. Now we're going to move on to discuss more migration issues, I think, with Leah. So Leah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Helene, and others for the invitation to be here today. I am going to tell a hopeful story today, comparing the immigrants that you see here in this canonical picture of the Ellis Island waiting room 100 years ago on the left with immigrants to the United States today. I'll focus as much as possible on outcomes for women, though I'll point to a few data restrictions that makes it harder to look at women in the past. In some ways, the immigrants who arrived in the past were very different from immigrants today. They entered during a period of near open borders in the late 19th and early 20th century to European immigrants. None of them required even a visa or a passport for travel, and they did not need to prove that they had a family member or a job waiting for them. We hear a nostalgic view about immigrants during this period from politicians on both sides of the aisle. The idea is that immigrants entered with nothing, they were penniless, but moved quickly into the middle class through their own hard work. And many politicians nowadays contrast these supposedly hardworking immigrants with migrants today. And particularly over the past few years, there's been intense public focus on what's been called surges of migration at the southern border. And so this is joint work with Ron Abramitski at Stanford. We've been reassessing common myths about this age of mass migration from Europe in order to compare immigrants in the past and present. And what we find is very different from this conventional wisdom. We find that despite major changes in immigration policy and in who comes to the United States over time, as well as changes in the welfare state, we see one common immigration story that unites these arrivals both in the past and present. And that story in particular is that, of course, immigrants do arrive on average earning less than the US born and holding different cultural practices. But there is substantial convergence or catch up between immigrants and the US born that takes place in the first generation. However, both in the past and the present, this catch up is incomplete. And it's the children of immigrants that complete the catch up to the children of the US born. So we focus on the children of immigrants today, and that we have much prior work on the immigrant generation itself, both in economic and cultural terms. But I want, for my message today, to talk about the children of immigrants, which I think is best summarized by this quote, which comes from what was our proudest moment in academia when our work actually escaped from the ivory tower to show up on late night television on a talk show on Showtime. And this quote was from one of the talk show hosts, Jesus, who you see on the left-hand side of the picture. Jesus and Mero are the talk show hosts, and they're both the children of immigrants from the Caribbean. And they said, recent study found that children of immigrants do better than children of those born in the US. So a friend saw this and said, wait a second, these guys are talking about Leah and Ron's research. And that pretty much summarizes what we find. What they didn't mention is that this fact is true both in the past and today to roughly equal degree and from nearly every sending country. So what they did is they went, Jesus and Mero did a little segment going out onto a street corner in Queens, New York, which they called Our Ellis Island. They went out with Hassan Minhaj, who's the comedian here in the middle of the picture, who's also the child of immigrants. His parents moved to the US from India. And they stopped a bunch of people walking by on the street. So if you're in Queens, you're mostly going to be stopping either immigrants or the children of immigrants. That's primarily who lives in that borough. And they asked, how has your life turned out? So for most of the kids of immigrants, they had very hopeful stories to tell, but they all pointed out that they had not lived up to their parents' high expectations for them. Only one person said he was a success in his parents' eyes, and they joked, oh, you must be a lawyer who's also a doctor. And he said, no, I never became either of those things. I'm just an engineer. So one of the possible mechanisms might be high aspirations that immigrants have for their kids, and we can think at the end of my talk about mechanisms. But let me start by just showing you some of the facts. This is some data for the modern period that comes from the Opportunity Insights Lab. Underlying this data is tax records, where a child is attached to his or her parent through being listed as a tax dependent during childhood. So you see the social security number of the child and then can follow that social security number into the adult labor market. We do not have the underlying microdata that sits at the Opportunity Insights Lab, but we were provided with averages for average earnings of the children of both US-born and immigrants who were raised at the 25th percentile. Okay, so this is sort of the working poor. And I noticed when I was putting this slide together that this comes from a published paper, and we said children of immigrants, but what we meant was sons. And I'll show you some evidence for daughters on the next slide, but we labeled this figure children and the other figure daughters, which was actually just a kind of artifact of the fact that our historical data can only follow sons, and I'll explain in a second. But I was really chagrined as I was putting these slides together for a topic on gender equality that we just conflated children and sons. So just something to be mindful of for myself and for all of our work. So essentially what we see in this picture are two facts. The first is that the children of immigrants out-earn the children of the US-born from almost every sending country. So you can see the darker black bar here. These are the sons of US-born fathers. They were raised at the 25th percentile of the income distribution, and they themselves reached the 45th percentile. So there's upward mobility relative to the father, but you can see that the children of fathers from almost every sending country in the world outperform the children of US-born fathers. And the second fact is to try to break down the degree of success, because we have a range from around reaching the 45th percentile up to almost the 65th percentile. And there are some interesting differences by country of origin. So first, we have a set of Asian countries where the children raised at the 25th percentile are doing exceedingly well: Hong Kong, China, India, Taiwan, etc. Then we have a series of European countries, Yugoslavia, Italy, Greece, and so on. Then some Central American countries, especially countries that are pointed to today as being sort of unable to assimilate, and we should turn these migrants back at the border, according to many politicians. So this would include here Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Mexico. So these kids raised by fathers from these countries are actually doing substantially better than children of the US-born. And then finally, we have a set of Caribbean countries that are doing a bit worse than sons of the US-born. So I want you to kind of try to keep this mapping in your mind as we turn to looking at daughters. We have the Asian countries where the sons are doing the best, then European, then Central American and South American, and then finally Caribbean. And the pattern is going to be somewhat different for daughters. Okay, so this was our graph for daughters, and of course we called them immigrants' daughters rather than immigrants' children. And we have the same sort of headline finding, which is that the daughters of immigrant fathers are outperforming the daughters of the US-born. But then we have interesting differences across sending region. So we have some places where the patterns are quite similar. We have a set of Asian countries that are up at the top. Here, China, Vietnam, Hong Kong, so it's not quite the same order. And then in the middle, a set of Central and Latin American countries. But daughters of parents from the Caribbean are actually doing quite well. So it's an interesting, a complex story. It's not simply that being the child of an immigrant from a majority Black country, those children are not able to experience upward mobility in the US. In fact, we see that the daughters are doing quite well, and it's the sons, particularly from Caribbean countries, that aren't quite reaching the level of sons of the US-born. Though we do have some other majority Black countries where that's not true, Dominican Republic and Nigeria. And then finally, quite intriguingly, the daughters of families from Europe are actually performing the worst. Some are just a bit above a US-born daughter, the daughters of the US-born. This is Spain and France. Some are a bit below, Germany, UK, and Hungary. So this does raise to mind for me some of the work by Raquel Fernandez and co-authors about the persistence of female labor force participation patterns across generations, and some of the preferences that are formed. It was discussed in Marianne's lecture that are persistent across generations. So just to summarize some of these findings, you can see in the scatter plot that there is a set of countries where the daughters are performing better than the sons from the same family. And so this is the Asian countries, as well as the Caribbean countries, and some where the daughters are performing worse. That includes all of the European countries, as well as a set of the Central American countries. So I now want to turn to comparing this very successful story for today to the past. These are immigrants that, as I mentioned, are often pointed to in nostalgic fashion, saying that these were the immigrants from Europe who arrived with little and moved up very quickly. So to get a sense of how immigration to the US has evolved over time, of course, here we are today, where around 14% of the US population is foreign born, but that's not at all the only time in US history where this has happened. Here I'm graphing out the share foreign born in the US population from the place of birth question in the census that goes all the way back to 1850. And you can see this whole 50 or 60 year period, which we call the age of mass migration from Europe, where the US population was 14 to 15% born for a very long time. So we're only recently entering into an era of a second age of mass migration, and we'll see what happens going forward. Are we going to have this 50 or 60 years, or is policy going to come in again and make major changes at the border? That's indeed what happened in the 1920s after 50 or 60 years of open migration, a set of highly restrictive immigration quotas. Now, there's no reason to expect that immigrants in the past and present would be doing the same for a couple of major reasons. One is sending region. So in the age of mass migration from Europe, migrants are from Europe. You can see that the orange section here, Northern and Western Europe, primarily UK, Ireland, Germany, and the pink section as well, Southern and Eastern Europe comes in a bit later, Italy, Poland, Russian Empire, and so on. The blue section in the past is almost entirely Canada. So many of those migrants would have been European origin as well. Whereas today, of course, Europe represents only around 10% of our immigrant stock, and the majority from Central and Latin America, as well as from Asia. There's also major differences in immigration policy. The border was nearly open to all European entrants 100 years ago, and today borders are far more restricted. So there's a set of quotas that allow entry and far more demand for entry than there are slots for entry legally, and therefore around a quarter of immigrants in the second age of mass migration are undocumented. So simply because of sending country differences, and as well as because of legal differences, we might not expect there to be much commonality. And yet, in fact, we find a very similar pattern in past and present. Our historical data is not from tax records. It is from the US Census. After 72 years, the census is completely released to the public with all of the individual attributes that would otherwise be anonymized made available. So we have all of the names and street addresses of the individuals in the census released up till the 1940 census. We can then put together linking algorithms that allow us to compare a person over time, or to find a person living with their child and look for that child in adulthood. The downside of this approach is that we cannot follow women over time very easily. If we're thinking about the daughters of immigrants, many of them are going to be, living with their parents, having their parents' last name, called the maiden name, and then when they get married, they'll switch to their married name. There has been some advancement recently in the linking literature using marriage certificates to find a daughter listed with her maiden name and her married name included. And so maybe in 5 years, we'll have the capacity to look at daughters, but we don't have that capacity yet. And so what we find are some graphs that look very similar to the modern data. So we see that the children of US-born fathers, or I should say sons of US-born fathers, are raised at the 25th percentile, are achieving some upward mobility themselves, but not as much as the children of immigrant parents from almost every sending country. And interestingly, it was countries like Portugal, Ireland, and Italy that were pointed to by politicians in the past as sort of never being able to assimilate, that in fact are achieving the most upward mobility for their kids. How do these children of immigrants catch up? Well, the Desus and Mero hypothesis was that it was parental aspirations, that immigrant parents may have different values that they transmit to their kids. We actually find that the most important factor is geography. Where do immigrant parents settle? Immigrant parents are more likely than the US born to move to areas that offer upward mobility for everyone. And so there is a special immigrant value that's reflected here. Immigrants have revealed themselves being willing to move and break family ties from their home country to move to the US to seek opportunity. And once they come to the US, they find the locations that offer the most upward mobility for all. So to give you a sense of that, let's just look at, say, the 1910 historical cohort. Here is the raw upward mobility gap between the children of immigrants and the children of the US born. It's 6 rank points. So, moving from, let's say, the 45th percentile up to the 51st percentile. And you just start thinking about geography and you can completely explain that gap. A lot of it has to do with the fact that immigrants did not move to the historical US South, which was a location of poor upward mobility for everyone, both Blacks and whites. It was a highly agricultural and cotton growing region. But beyond the US South, there's also the fact that immigrants are moving to particular urban areas. And so once you've included county fixed effects so that you're comparing two families that are living in close proximity, there's actually no immigrant advantage, but it's simply that immigrants are finding the locations in the US that are offering mobility for all. Okay, so I think I haven't been keeping close track on the time, but I think I'm pretty much out of time. So
you have a few minutes to conclude. It's fine.
Okay, yeah. I will just sort of conclude by summarizing what we've been talking about. There's very clear evidence that children of immigrants in the United States have high rates of upward mobility, despite major changes in policy, despite major changes in who comes to the US. And that this is true for almost all sending countries, including those countries that are causing substantial political concern today, which are countries in the Northern Triangle from Central America. It's true also for both sons and daughters, though there also are some intriguing gender differences by region that are certainly worth further exploration.
Thank you very much, Leah. So we learned a lot here, and I think in the discussion would be interesting to try to discuss whether this is also applicable, you think, to other countries, or whether there are particular features here of the US that might show up. But it's certainly fascinating that across centuries you have similar patterns, and this distribution of geography of the different countries and how they do is pretty interesting. So we'll come back to that for sure in the discussion.
Thank you.
Great. Now, Rachel, you have a last one, and it's going to be more related to the current pandemic.
Thanks very much to Helene and Laurence for organizing what's been very interesting talk already. So I'm going to talk really briefly about what's happened over the pandemic to women's labor market participation and what might be some of the short and long-term consequences of that. That's of course speculative, but I'll get us thinking about that. And I'm going to focus on the UK. All my data that I have is from the UK. Some of what I'll say will probably be pretty specific to the UK context, but some I think will have more general relevance, and I hope that'll be clear from what I say. And I should say that almost everything I'm going to talk about is drawing on other people's work, colleagues at IFS. And if you're interested in seeing more about the statistics, they're all available on the IFS website, so look there. So just to start, it's important to remember, at least when thinking about the UK, but I think this is relevant for most countries, that prior to the pandemic, what the situation was prior to the pandemic, because a lot of what the pandemic has done is to accentuate trends, particularly trends in inequalities that existed before. And so that's one of the things that I want to talk about really is like, what were the differences in women's experiences and how much might the pandemic accentuate those as opposed to close them down? So in the UK prior to the pandemic, there were very large differences in prosperity, in income inequality. There was large income inequality, but there was also other differences in prosperity along ethnic lines, along regional lines, and particularly across men and women. In particular, women were much more likely to be living in poverty than men because of lower labor market participation and because if you were a single parent, you had a much higher probability of being in poverty. So prior to the pandemic, there was already some important inequalities. And I think, the people who've been hit hardest by the pandemic are lower income people, and lower income women may have been particularly hard hit. So also prior to the pandemic, the gender pay gap in the UK had been reducing for quite some time, back much more prior, as Marianne showed us, much more before the 1990s, but most recently from the late 1990s to the early 2000s. But actually in the UK, that narrowing of the gap had rather flattened, and we hadn't seen a lot of change in the recent past. So that the growth originally was due to wage growth, faster wage growth for women, and rising hours of work for women. And both of those things have slightly stagnated in the UK in the most recent period. So entering into the pandemic, that was the situation. So what did the pandemic do? We all know this, but just to remind ourselves, it shut down many sectors of the economy. And so one way that I'll show you that it affected women is that it hit sectors that women worked in more harder. And so that's led to less labor market participation amongst women. Whether that will persist or not is an open question. It increased working from home. So many people, largely higher income people, increased the probability of working from home. And of course, it massively disrupted the education of women, which of course has big implications for those children themselves. Massively disrupted the education of children, which of course has very big implications for those children, but also had big implications for parental time use, which affected women disproportionately. So let me just show you a couple of key facts and then talk about what I think they might mean. So this is a picture from a survey done by some colleagues at IFS that looks at everyone who was in paid work in February 2020, so just at the start of the pandemic, and then looks at what their work status was very early on in the pandemic, so a couple months in, and distinguishes between mothers and fathers. So it's parents who were in paid work in February 2020. And the gray bars show you people who either lost their jobs, the light gray bars, the proportion who lost their job, were fired or laid off. The dark gray bars, people who were furloughed. So in the UK, that was a scheme where you were put out of work, but the government paid a substantial part of your salary. The light green is people that were working from home, and the dark green is from people who were still continuing to go to work, who had a job that required you to go to work and were allowed to work. So what you see from this is that mothers are 9 percentage points more likely to have stopped work than fathers. So that was either because they were more likely to be laid off, in part because they were working in sectors that were harder hit, or because firms decided that they were the ones to be laid off rather than men. In due time, we'll know the difference between that. We don't know that yet. They were more likely to be furloughed, again, in part because of the jobs they had, but in part because of choices that firms made. And so overall, if you look prior to the crisis, mothers were in paid work 80% of the rate that fathers work, whereas a couple months in, women were at paid work 70% of the rate that fathers were at work. So while we entered the pandemic already with women, there was a flattening off of the growth in participation by women. This seems to have set that back by some amount. The second thing we see, again, using the same data, if you look at, compare in April 2020, how mothers and fathers were spending their time on childcare, what proportion of the days, there's a time use survey, and compare that to 2015, which is the most recent data we have prior to the pandemic, we see that both mothers and fathers increased the amount of time they were spending on childcare. But mothers were still doing more than fathers, but the rate of increase is higher for fathers. And this is perhaps one glimmer of hope I'll come back to talk about whether the pandemic has been enough of a change in our habits to have some persistent effect. So certainly the immediate effect has been to lead to mothers having to spend more time doing childcare, both compromising hours of work or the quality of work they're doing if they're trying to do two simultaneously. as I'll show you later, it also seemed to have had some negative effects on the mental health of women. But it's what the good news that we've seen is that fathers have also very significantly increased the time spent on childcare in ways that we haven't seen if you went back and looked at time use surveys prior. The time that men spent on childcare was increasing, but not at this rate. So it may be that something about that large increase is persistent. The report on this survey has lots of fantastic statistics, but just one further one that I'll highlight shows you how it's the same statistics I just showed you before, how parents are spending their time, how much is on childcare, how much is on housework, and how much is on paid work. And so, pretty much everyone spent more time on childcare, mothers and fathers, more time on housework, and less time on paid work. But what's interesting is that this distinguishes households where the father earns more and where the mother earns more. And so one might have thought that the reasons that we see mothers having taken on more, as in Marianne's talk, so if mothers on average were earning lower salaries than fathers, then maybe in a time of financial hardship, the household decides optimally to let the higher earner concentrate on work and the lower earner concentrate on childcare. But we don't see that here. We see that even when the mother is the higher earner, the mother is still increasing the amount of time on childcare by more than, they're still doing more childcare than the father, and doing more housework. Now, fathers did change, and so there was again a rate of change amongst fathers, but it's still the case that mothers were bearing the brunt of that, even when they were the higher earners. So, so overall, what we saw is that the pandemic had a really big effect on the labor market activities of everyone, and hit the lowest paid and poorest people hardest, and hit many different communities very hard, so ethnic minorities in particular. But focusing on women, it did hit the labor market of activities of women harder than men, because women were more likely to be working in shutdown sectors. By the way, that's quite different to the past few recessions, where recessions have tended to hit male-dominated sectors more than female-dominated sectors. So in that sense, the recession that follows the pandemic will be a little bit different than in that way, as in many others. But women were also more likely to have lost jobs or to have been furloughed, which of course will have much important long-term consequences, we imagine. It also changed people's time use. Women continued to do more childcare and homework than men, but men increased the amount they did by more, a glimmer of hope. And worryingly, a little bit tangential, but I think potentially, again, having long-term effects, recent evidence is showing that women's mental health deteriorated by almost twice as much as men's, at least in the initial phases of the pandemic. And the relationship between that and what they had to deal with is one that I'm sure will be studied into the future, but could have long-term consequences. So what are the likely consequences of this to be? I mean, here, I don't have, I'm crystal ball gazing slightly, but just to start thinking about. So the immediate effects of the pandemic are to increase inequalities. We've seen that already, and that's likely to, as the pandemic plays out, that's likely to be even more true. So it's accentuated income inequalities. We know that lower income households have been harder hit in terms of labor market. Higher income households have been more likely to be able to work from home and more likely to keep their jobs. So it's increased income inequalities, it's increased socioeconomic inequalities in education and skills. Particular children in lower SES households have been less able to keep up with education. And so it's likely to increase intergenerational inequalities. And all of those will have differential implications on gender. It's also has already and likely to persistently lead to some shifts in the structure of the economy. So for example, we've seen big growth in retail, online retail, and we've seen in the UK at least many stores shutting down already. Women are much more likely to work in the retail sector, and that's part of the reason why they've been more likely to lose their job. There's other sectors that have been more or less affected. We've also seen a big increase in working from home. People are saying now that that's likely to last. In the UK, you've seen some initial indications of people migrating out of cities, for example. And so while initially that may not have been good for women's work opportunities because they were juggling home life with children being at home too. And I know in many instances, women were finding that very productivity decreasing. And so it was problematic for their long-term work. It does lead to the potential for an increased number of office-based jobs to be undertaken at home or at least remotely, which means that the job opportunity set for women may change. And as Marianne emphasized, that's been one of the things that people have pointed to in terms of keeping women's wages down. And so if we do see that materialize, that may be an important area for policymakers to think about that could open up the job opportunities for women and the ability to juggle family life, etc. So in the longer term, what are we going to see? So it may be that this reduction in work experience hampers earnings progression for women and for low-paid people. We've seen already that there's the sort of child premium, which is, in part at least, a reduction in work experience and dampens pay progression. If we see that women disproportionately spend a couple of years out of the labor market as we go through the post-pandemic recession, then we may see higher rates of unemployment amongst women, and especially low-paid women who work in retail and hospitality, which has been very hardly hit. That may have also consequences of job losses are more severe for single parents, which are almost entirely women, and so they may be more severe. As I just said, increasing ability to work from home could benefit women, depending on how that plays out, but certainly policy could help accentuate that. And there was a sustained, we did see this bigger responsiveness of fathers to participate in childcare. It's bigger than we've seen in the past. And so it could be that this was enough of a kick and change in people's behavior to maybe shift that. And that very compelling slide that Marianne showed that, a large part of the gender pay gap, particularly among higher earning couples, is due to childcare. And so that is maybe potentially the silver lining. So that was very quick whirlwind, but I'll stop there and leave time for discussion.
Thank you very much. That was a fantastic overview of you three. So please, you will feel free at any time to interact with one another and react to the presentation on others, including Marianne. But I will start with a few questions. We did get some questions for all of you in the chat, and I will convey them to you as well as add a few of my own. So for Anna, there was a question regarding, you showed this evidence on intimate partner violence and how it was related to economic conditions, but there are some questions whether this is also related to single parenting, to the divorce or to the family situation, and it must be very hard to disentangle all that because it's probably all endogenous, but do you have any insight on this?
Yeah, so marriage is actually protective. So you see lower rates of intimate partner violence in married households. It is cohabiting and sort of more boyfriend-girlfriend relationships where you actually see the highest rates of intimate partner violence. You also see the highest rates among the young. So that also sort of feeds into it. So yes, it is a very sort of complicated relationship. Of course, marriage is highly endogenous. It's not surprising if you think about it, that marriage would be protective in that sense.
Yeah, very good. And I guess that's a question for both Anna and Rachel, because both of you pointed out in a way the importance of the economic situation for children. So that was very much, one way of transferring inequality from one generation to another in Anna's work and presentation. But Rachel, also you pointed out the great problem that we are facing right now with the education issues and very unequal access to remote learning. This is a big issue in the UK. I don't know across countries if this is as unequal as in the UK, but it certainly is. And to what extent do we know how persistent the effect of that problem is going to be? So the effect of missing some part of education, and in particular for maybe a certain categories of children. Do we have any views on this, and what are the policies there? So anyone who wants to jump in on this?
So I can jump in on that. I think it's I think there's two things to say. One is I think it's even worse than you're saying, because so we know that education is a really important determinant driver of of people growing up in poverty's ability to move out of poverty. And so it's not only that the children in poor households missed out on education, but those are the households that are also hardest hit, and they're more likely to be led by women, for example. The estimates, there have been some very good studies done, surveys, ones on the Economic Observatory, for example. The estimates of the impact this will have on educational outcomes is very large, a very large detrimental effect to children. And so I think it's enormously important that policies put in place programs to catch those children up, because I think that will be enormously important for those children's future abilities.
Yeah, I'll just add, the U.S. is seeing really shocking numbers with respect to declines in learning among children during the pandemic. And if you just sort of think about Summer's slide and multiply that by 10, 12, we're really talking about pretty massive effects here on learning of children, and huge disparities in the U.S. Private schools, even parochial schools, Catholic schools, are doing considerably better than many of the public schools in this regard, and it's very troubling.
There's been also, I don't know kind of like how much of a catch up is possible, but there are clearly some cohorts for which we know it's going to be impossible. So for example, the rate of kind of high school students applying to whether it is like a four-year college or a community college, especially in the poor parts of the US, have been just dramatically declining. And I think it's going to be really hard for the particular generation that's, that is been graduating high school in these years to ever make this up. It's pretty distressing.
I just want to add one quick thing. So recently there's been a lot of attention on mental health, particularly of the adolescents and young adolescents. It's been really quite devastating. And there's recent work in economics that really mental health conditions are incredibly predictive of labor market outcomes, far more so than physical health. Mental health is incredibly predictive of future labor market outcomes. And what we're seeing here is really troubling. Again, Marianne was sort of pointing to certain cohorts. I think adolescents will really bear the brunt of that.
So mental health among teenagers or among also students? I know in France, this has been an issue. I mean, Laurence may correct me on this, but also the deterioration in mental health of students. Do we have any idea, whether there are differential effects depending on the age or in terms of these long-run consequences? Or?
Yeah, well, these things tend to be observed more easily among adolescents. Suicide attempts and things of that nature are more likely to be adolescent behavior. So there could, in fact, be significant mental health impacts on younger kids, but that's harder to measure. It's more often manifest among adolescents.
Okay, thank you very much. So we also have a question for Leah here. There's a question about whether you have explored differences between social mobility across generations between African American population due to slavery stayed in the South, right? Whereas you pointed out that it was really important where you were actually settling. So do you have any information on that? Yes.
Yes, it's very important to recognize and think of the Black population in the US as also a migrant population. Of course, it's internal migration, but it follows many of the same dynamics that we see in our work on international migration. Up until around 1915 or 1920, 90% of Blacks lived in the South, which was a very low mobility region. And over the next 60 or 70 years, there were 4 or 5 million Black migrants up to northern and western cities. And that had a really dramatic effect on the economic situation of the first generation, in the sense that you could double your income by leaving the South. And then from what we learned from Anna's work, probably for the second generation as well, though it's been pretty hard to follow that second generation just for some data constraints that the census stopped asking about parental state of birth. And so we know much more about country of parent birth if they're foreign born than we know about internal migration. Though I do believe there's some work that's been started on this. I think that Adriana Yarasmuni, and maybe Anna is even involved, has been able to do some connections with census in order to take a look at that second generation for the Great Black Migration from the South. I'd also would point to Alora de Renoncourt's recent work, and she's looking at Black children who are growing up in northern and western cities that were the sites of the Great Black Migration, who were born in 1980. So some of them might be second generation, some of them might be third generation. And she's finding that by that point, being raised in a city that had a history of large Black inflows is actually detrimental to the second or third generation. And some of the mechanisms might have to do with the political economy side, that when there's a large Black inflow, the white population reacts and may increase policing, for example, increase incarceration. So some of these same dynamics we need to think about when we think about international migration as well. It's not just a single family, but it's also a more dynamic system that when you're in a location with a large Black population or a large immigrant population, there can be feedback from the existing population, and it can change the trajectory and the outcomes.
Yeah, and precisely on that, I found it surprising that you explain all your effects simply by the geographical allocation. I would have expected also that maybe going into a part of the country in which there is a strong network of people who have immigrated before, so some kind of community effect would have played a role. But you don't seem to find that, so I found that surprising. Do you have any view on this?
Yeah, we did look at differences between people who are living in counties with many from their own country and those who are living in places that did not have many from their own country, and we did not find differences in upward mobility for the second generation there. And so, I mean, there can be countervailing effects from being in an enclave. In some sense, it might hold you back in terms of learning English. In other sense, it might help you in terms of labor market networks. And so maybe that's what's going on there. But I do think, and so Helene had asked a bit about US versus Europe contrast. I think we ourselves haven't done work on Europe, but we do compare what we find to European contexts. And we often see that there's more upward mobility or better outcomes for immigrants in the US than there is in Europe. One of the factors could be the geography story. More European countries are involved with where immigrants live. There's more active resettlement and more attention to sort of deconcentrating immigrants away from particular locations. Whereas in the US, it's almost always been the case that it's up to the immigrant family to make that choice. Is an enclave better for me, or is it better for me to move into a more integrated neighborhood? Is it better for me to be in a city or in a smaller location? And so when immigrants have that freedom to locate in the place that is best for their family, that's one of the factors that may explain the differences between the two contexts.
Thank you very much. So we also have quite a bit of question here, for Rachel coming in about whether if women are thought to work better in teams and get rewarded for this, will increase working from home actually harm them, at least on this dimension. So I think this is a big debate that is, I think, quite broad on how working from home is affecting differently, potentially, the productivity of men and women. And we go back to maybe some kind also of gender stereotype issues that were highlighted in Marianne's talk. So it would be pretty interesting to hear all of you on this type of issues.
I was going to say, I would probably think Marianne probably knows more about this than me. My guess is that, are women really better at teamwork? I don't know. Marianne, I found that the discussion of the work by Hyde fascinating, and I was going to go read that more. But the other thing I'd say though is I think we need to question whether working online, I think you still need to engender teamwork, and are women that much less in engendering teams on Zoom than they are in person? That's not been my personal experience so far, but I have no idea. So I think we need to think about that, about whether, you know, working on Slack and Zoom, women have exactly the same advantages that they have in the office. But Marianne probably has more.
Yeah, as I said, I'm not aware of any research kind of suggesting that women are not as able to, you know, or better to do teamwork than men are. I mean, one other thing that comes to mind when thinking about the move to a remote environment and how it may kind of differentially impact men and women is that, you know, one can imagine that, like, you know, kind of the politics in the office and the time spent on the water cooler, where a lot of these old boys network tend to, kind of advantage men might play a less important role, in the future, which is another potential silver lining.
Yeah, there's the whole issue of networking, right? Which is also a big literature on whether men are more apt somehow to have tight networks than women, and how is that going to be affected by remote work? It's pretty
exactly.
It's quite an interesting side project, I think, in this literature.
But I guess going back to what we were talking about earlier, I mean, it's not clear that remote working will be everyone working remotely, and so if there is selection into that, I mean, that could also accentuate things in a negative way if we have some of the factors at play that Marianne was emphasizing. If all the women choose to be remote and all the men go.
Yeah, but I think I really like kind of all that you highlighted, Rachel, in terms of like what could potentially happening. I think maybe what's also, I think, really important, and maybe that you didn't stress as directly, is that I think a lot of corporations were very concerned about, kind of offering remote work, and made employees kind of pay a cost for that, pay a price for that, because they had this, belief that working from home will be less productive. And my sense is that a lot of these corporations actually learning they can get, as much from their workers, in a remote environment than in physical space. I think that's why we are seeing some of the changes, kind of with a lot of work that's going to stay remote. So I think that could also, help women, is that, sounds kind of maybe the price that you're going to have to pay for flexibility is not going to be as high in the future than it was in the past.
Right, and that's with the work of Claudia Golding that you cited, I think that could be very important indeed. But it's not so clear it's going to, the heterogeneity across sectors there. It's not so clear how it's going to play out, because if I remember well, it was, sectors like, I don't know, corporate lawyers, or where the flexibility is very binding for women. And so when we go back to more normal times, is it still going to be the case that you're going to need to go for dinner with your clients, essentially, or not? Or is it going to be altered or not? I think that's,
Hopefully not.
Okay. Okay, so it remains to be seen.
But to come back to the policy question, I mean, there may be things that policymakers can do to help move in that direction. I don't know exactly what they are, but I think to bring it back to policy, it's like if that kind of flexibility really doesn't have a genuine productivity cost, then we should be moving more in that direction. And so are there things that policy could do to help make that more feasible? I think that those are really important things to think about.
I think if you look, there was some survey done here on businesses asking them whether they think the increase in teleworking would lead to an increase in productivity or a decrease in productivity. And a minority of firms talked about a decrease in productivity. So all of them thought that was better. At the same time, and I think it goes back to some of the things Marianne was saying in terms of policy. You have tax policy, especially for the second wage earner, that's massive. But also something that was highlighted as well in Marianne, but that we've looked at quite a lot here, childcare facility opening hours. If you look at the Netherlands, for example, or Germany, school starts at 3 p.m. in the afternoon in Germany. That's difficult to reconcile with any type of work, whether you, unless you work from home. but you can't work from home 5 days of the week. You look at the Netherlands, no lunches is provided to kids in school. So how do you do if you're working in an office? So I think there's a lot of policies related, and there was one slide of mine on this related to the kids environment that would allow actually a lot more flexibility to women without having an impact on their salary that we should consider. And by the way, a lot of people working here actually want to come back to the office and start meeting people again. Thanks for the great presentations.
Yes, so we thank you very much, Laurence. So maybe one more issue that came up in the question, which is also interesting, is the potential effect of COVID on business creation. So there's a remark here that business creation in the UK, but also I think I believe in other advanced economies has gone up, and this seems to be a surge in startups concentrated in retail, presumably e-commerce. So the guess here is that even though we don't have data on the gender of entrepreneurs, that there could be a lot of women in these entrepreneurs, and whether that could be actually a game changer if this trend endures in terms of having more female entrepreneurs concentrated in e-commerce. So any views on the effect on the COVID shock on female entrepreneurship and reallocation of labor from retail to e-commerce?
I'd be surprised if a majority of those were women. I don't know the statistics on that, but I would be incredibly surprised if that was true. If that is true, that's great, but that has not been true before, and I wouldn't see why that would be true now. Why more women would have been entering into entrepreneurship.
It would actually be a substitution for job losses, I guess. I mean, if women disproportionately lost their jobs, but it's true that we don't know. Yeah. So that's probably something quite interesting to look at in the statistics. Okay, well, I think unless any of you would like to make some final comments, we are getting towards the end of this super fascinating discussion. So anyone wants to have a last word?
Thank everybody.
I'm definitely going to thank everybody. I just wanted to see if anyone wanted to add a point. So if not, then I would definitely want to thank our fantastic speakers. Right, we had really we learned a lot today, and also the OECD, and in particular Laurence there. So I think there's a lot that remains to be discussed on these topics. There's going to be a lot of data coming in also after this COVID shock. I just want to point to all of you that CEPR has a section of its website which is dedicated specifically on women in economics. So if you are interested, please take a look. There's a lot of material in it. And in particular, we publish, to go back to the profession a bit, we publish in real time the gender composition of the faculty in all European universities. So the split is currently 2/3 male, 1/3 female. And if we look at professors, it's actually 25% female. So I think today we have definitely shown that, the amazing contribution that you are making to the knowledge in economics. And so I think if we keep on working closely linked policymakers, OECD, other policy institutions and academia, we can really make things move forward. And there's a lot of good research to inform policy. So that's the good news. And thank you so much again.